How do I look? Like one of us. Kim, doesn't this all feel a little bit culty? Don't be silly. This is good for us.
Many moments later.
Don't break the circle. Sit back down. Damn it!
Don't swim out.
Separate Ways finally dropped. I haven't looked at it yet, but I'm glad to know it maintains the same quality as the base game, yellow paint notwithstanding. An interesting side effect from the advent of new Resident Evil content is a surge of AA titles inspired by the modern remakes. One of those titles happens to be The Chant. The Chant is a 2022 survival horror game by Brass Token. You play as Jess, a young woman suffering from guilt over a childhood tragedy she shares with her best friend Kim. The two have gone their separate ways, god damn it, and sought out different methods to deal with their grief. After a really bad episode, Jess decides to finally take up Kim's offer and try her method. Unfortunately, Kim's method involves going to a remote island, joining Jared Leto's Not cult, microdosing on herbal supplements.
I didn't drug you. That tea is 100% organic.
And performing a ritual to reveal extra-dimensional monsters like the movie From Beyond. It's up to Jess to target wrangle the other Kool-Aid drinkers and use their prisms to complete the ritual and purge the thetans from Kim's body. I can't tell if I like this game. I didn't hate it, but I wasn't enthralled with it either. I find its premise unique, but I think its ambition far exceeds its reach. Before we get into the weeds, let me explain how the Chant plays. The game is broken up into several chapters. Each chapter focuses on a member of the group that you have to rescue to recover their prism. It shouldn't shock you, then, that getting the prism usually means they've either died or are about to die. At first, Jess operates like how you'd expect a character with third-person controls would on a controller. Left stick to move Jess, right stick to pan the camera, and click and left stick to sprint. But where most games treat sprinting as a temporary state that you can break out of by doing another action, switching between walking and sprinting feels more like a toggle in the Chant. Once you click into sprint, there's no need to ever go back to walking. And when you die and go back to a checkpoint, the game always reverts to Jess's walking speed. It's not a negative trait, but rather a nuance of the gameplay that takes a bit to figure out. Just like what you'd expect from a survival horror game, you spend most of your time in the Chant either exploring spaces to find keys to open any locked doors, or fighting enemies. If you've played a modern RE title, then you'll be comfortable with navigating the inventory screen. Unlike RE, you don't have to manage a limited storage space. You always have more than enough room in your workout bag to bring everything with you. Sometimes keys come in the form of geometric patterns made out of wrought metal. You'll have to find them piecemeal and combine them before you're able to use them on the corresponding doors. Each chapter features an environmental puzzle that you have to solve to progress. They're pretty straightforward and mostly require you to find unique objects that operate as glorified keys. One of the puzzles involves Isaac Newton shenanigans with a lighthouse. The one puzzle that actually required me to activate some neurons involved matching the symbols on the plant beds in a greenhouse with a chart that teaches you how to make weed killer. This one's cool because you can ruin the mixture if you're not paying attention to the hints, and there's an achievement for making the weed killer without screwing up. The last puzzle is really just collecting a bunch of Dragon Balls from a row of small cottages and placing them in the right order to unlock a big door. Each cottage has a hint showing the correct order for the corresponding Dragon Ball. I'm not going to act like I'm an expert on survival horror design just because I've clocked a few hours into Resident Evil and Silent Hill. But there is a definite disparity in the challenge you face with Resident Evil puzzles versus puzzles from the Chant. To contrast, I'll use some of the puzzles in the early game of Resident Evil 2. One of the first things you have to find are 3 seals that are locked inside statues placed all throughout the RPD. To get these seals, you need to solve the codes on the statues. You find the hint for these codes on a cop who no longer has use for them. But the third statue has blood on the symbols, so they're not so easy to identify. You have to fudge it on the third statue to solve the puzzle, and it tests you on pattern recognition. As for keys, The Chant follows RE2's trend of differentiating keys via iconography. The RPD keys have playing card suits as emblems, and the Chant keys have different geometric patterns corresponding to locked doors. The difference is how and when they're used for their respective games. You get one of the suit keys early on in RE2, and Leon and Claire get two of the remaining keys when they return to the RPD. For most of the early and mid game, you're managing 3 of these keys and unlocking more of the starting area as you progress. In the Chant, you only ever need to use the keys you found in the current chapter. Once you move on to the next area, those keys stay in your inventory and collect dust. Don't take this as me putting down the Chant by gassing up Resident Evil. This is meant to show what Resident Evil does to add complexity to its puzzles. The Chant is more straightforward, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something you should be aware of if Steam recommends the game to you based on your playtime with Resident Evil. Let's move on to the combat. Despite comparing the Chant to Resident Evil, there's no gunplay. As Jess, you have to collect raw materials off the land and craft weapons out of them. Besides melee weapons, Jess can collect and craft projectile weapons that also double as traps. Jess has 3 attributes: mind, body, and spirit. These attributes correspond to the type of damage that enemies can cause on Jess, and vice versa. When you fight an enemy, you have to select the appropriate weapon type to get damage bonuses against your targets. You swing your melee weapon by either tapping R2 for light swings, or holding R2 for more powerful swings. Press circle to dodge enemy attacks, and double tap circle to dive away from attacks. Press R1 to throw your projectile weapon, or press triangle to lay it on the floor for enemies to run into. Press L1 to use your prism powers. Prism powers consume spirit energy, and require time to cool down after being used. As you collect more prisms, you get more powers added to the wheel. There's no nice way to say this. Combat doesn't feel satisfying. Most of that has to do with the 3-hit combos that Jess can do with their melee weapons. There's a very pregnant pause between combo strings, and I didn't see what difference charging R2 did over spamming it. What doesn't help is that enemies tend to flash before going into their attack animations, which means they're invincible while attacking. This results in an awkward dance between you and the enemies, where you're either spamming your combos or dodging theirs. You can mix up your attacks by tossing projectile weapons after a combo string to keep the damage going. If you time it right, you can stun an enemy while they do their invincible attack by hitting them with pocket salt. The prism powers also help to hasten the fights, but I only ever relied on 2 powers for most of the game. The Scream ability helps with crowd control and keeps the stun train going, but the best ability has to be the one where you can spawn a swarm of minions to chew through an enemy's health like a school of piranhas. I see what the Chant is trying to accomplish, but if I had to choose between this combat or swinging a knife at a liquor in RE2, then I'm headed over to Raccoon City in a heartbeat. The survival aspect isn't so much about resource gathering, but meter management and environmental barriers. Most of the island is blocked by color-coded auras called gloom. If you don't have the right prism, then you can't pass through the corresponding gloom. This is how the Chant controls progression across the island, along with its locked doors and puzzles. When you enter a gloom, your mind meter slowly ticks down. If your mind meter runs out, Jess will go into a panic attack, and you can't fight or use your projectile weapons until you refill the bar. You can restore your mind meter by either eating lavender or meditating. You can also stand on certain sigils to restore your mind. Hold X to meditate and transfer your spirit energy to your mind. You can recover your spirit energy by eating mushrooms or standing near crystals, which restore your spirit energy for 1 use of your prism powers. A neat trick is to stand near a crystal and meditate. You'll fill up your mind meter while the crystal restores just enough spirit energy for you to summon those minion swarms. You gain XP by killing enemies or consuming restoratives. In the upgrade menu, you can unlock skills after you've acquired enough XP in the requisite fields. Upgrades require prismic crystals. You can find these all throughout the island by clearing out optional enemy areas. Something to note with the combat is that you don't have to kill everything to make an area safe. If you kill the enemy that's creating the gloom, then you kill the enemies that reside in that gloom and gain their XP. Another thing to note is that the game differentiates between humanoid enemies and beasts. There's an achievement for going through the whole game without killing a single cultist. I recommend playing the game on easy if you want to clear it with little resistance. It's rough and unwieldy, but I can see how the gameplay loops in the Chant feed back into each other. You have to make sure all your meters are full, because not having enough mind prevents you from fighting, and running out of body results in death, and not having enough spirit prevents you from using your prism powers. You also have to be mindful of your inventory and whether you have enough resources to craft more melee weapons as they have durability, or whether you should use those resources to craft projectile weapons. Also, you have to make sure you have enough restoratives in case you take a couple of bad hits in the fight or got hit with too much psychic damage. After the first few chapters, I settled into the gameplay. The combat never felt satisfying, but I got really good at making the most out of my weapons and powers. So, what about the rest of the game? The best way I can sum up my feelings over the Chant is that I appreciate that the game is willing to go for such an out there premise, but the biggest enemy in the game isn't the giant toads, it's the budget. The game feels AA, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you can never shake that feeling off when you watch the character models animate. It's like several steps below Evil West fidelity, and what saves the game for me is that the voice work does a lot of heavy lifting to elevate the material, and the score has this great psychedelic horror vibe to it. From the outset, you kinda know that no one's getting off the island alive. Since they're all part of a cult, they've all got some baggage with them, and the From Beyond monsters know how to prey on their weaknesses.
I'm not leaving here. Those things can't hurt me or anybody else. They want to roam, and I will set them free. I've spoken to them.
What have you heard? What have they told you?
The truth! I told Tyler you were going to bring bad energy to this place.
Their insecurities and regrets take over their personalities, and you end up fighting the worst version of those characters.
There you are. Come here, my love. Nothing can tear us apart now.
If this were a dumber game, it would be Silent Hill Homecoming, but the inclusion of the cult really helps to make the setting more plausible.
The terrain here gets a bit rough.
What's with the bare feet, Kim? Doesn't that hurt?
Shoes are forbidden in the retreat. Don't worry, you'll get used to it.
My favorite character detail is how the cult leader changes after the ritual falls apart. He starts off making it seem like he's enlightened and welcoming, the textbook example of a new age guru bullshitter.
Welcome. I understand it took some convincing, but we're so glad you came.
But once the starfish monsters arrive, he becomes a huge fucking asshole.
Tyler, come out of there!
I'm not going anywhere with you. You've already gotten 2 people killed.
I ended up liking Jess as a protag. I don't think it's ever fully spelled out, but she has this phobia over flies due to her childhood trauma, and a persistent enemy in the game is a swarm of flies that you can disperse with your weapons, but it never truly goes away. It's no Mr. X or Nemesis, but it does make its presence known. Whenever you enter a gloom aura, you hear the voice of the person with the corresponding prism talking about their anxieties. The game is literally putting you in their headspaces. As you explore the island, you'll find notes and film reels that reveal more of the island's past. Turns out the place has always been a hotbed of horrible work conditions and greed over the crystals that you can only find on the island. It's also not the first time someone's tried to summon Lovecraft monsters with a cult. In fact, the game's opening sequence starts with you playing as a pregnant woman running away from her cult buddies after seeing the ritual go to shit. I know I said a lot of critical things toward the puzzles and combat, but I really do like what the Chant is doing. I like the premise that involves a new age cult, and now it's just reusing the same tactics as the cult before it. I like that the characters don't start off as evil, but become corrupted because of their own desires.
I can bring them back from the other side. I know how to do it.
Hannah, no!
My whole life, nobody ever cared about me. They do. Instead of trying to stop it, we can all be together.
Hannah, it's the gloom. You can't bring them back. Don't do it, Hannah, you'll...
Also, this is the only game I've ever played where a chase sequence doubles as a sort of boss rush. So is a Chant worth playing? I think so. If you can get over the initial hump, over the AA visuals, and how combat is the way it is, then you might enjoy the Chant. It's no Resident Evil or Silent Hill, and I'm glad that's the case because it's something new. My last nitpick is that the game has 3 endings, and they all depend on your dialogue choices. 2 of them are considered the bad endings, but I like how they're all twisted versions of Jess's attributes. If you keep picking dialogue options that focus on the body, Jess responds to questions by suppressing her actual emotions or pushing back against someone. To me, this ending represents her inability to learn from her mistakes, so she'll always be plagued by them. If you keep picking dialogue options that focus on the spirit, Jess responds to questions by pacifying whoever's speaking to her, or agreeing with them to avoid any tension. This ending is the most fun for what it is, but I think it's her reward for not fighting back whenever she's pressed about anything. If you keep picking dialogue options that focus on the mind, then congratulations, you got the best ending. This one shows Jess and Kim escaping the island on a boat only to get sucked up into a vortex. This is considered the best ending because it leads into the game's DLC. Oh yeah, there's DLC for this game. Now, before you cry out that they're nickel and diming the player to get the full story, do know that the DLC is free. No, I don't know why either, but I'm gonna have to cover it in another video, so stay tuned for that. Why is it called a chant when we don't hear any chanting? Like, I get why it's not called a spectrum, but the game is more about colors than sounds.